Hello, my loves, and welcome to this latest episode of Strange Playgrounds. Now, before we start talking about the haunting of Bly Manor itself, there is something that absolutely needs to be addressed, which highlights a fairly pervasive cultural problem when it comes to genre fiction, a media that is labeled and culturally derided as belonging to speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror in particular. Um, those of you who enjoy this particular Netflix series, who enjoyed The Haunting of Hill House, and who were looking forward to The Haunting of Bly Manor, can't help but have noticed that throughout our national media here in the UK, particularly when it comes to our published newspapers, both broadsheets and tabloids, both left wing and right wing, there have been some unutterably bad takes on The Haunting of Bly Manor. Not only that, but I would say there have been some unutterably bad faith takes on The Haunting of Bly Manor. There have been purportedly professional reviews in sort of, fingers raised, professional reviews written by purportedly professional critics that have been some of the most poorly written, just on a purely technical level, beyond whatever you happen to think of Bly Manor, and we'll get into that at some point. Just on a purely technical level. Now, the first of these that I came across, when I first started coming across these reviews, I'd barely begun watching it, so I hadn't even formulated my own perspectives on Bly Manor at this point. I didn't really know what I was going to think of it. But even then, even in that early state, I could see how bad, how just poorly written these reviews were. Many of them of a quality, just on a purely technical level, of a quality I would not allow to be published on my own meager website, which is just, it's a nothing, it's nowhere. It's for me, really. It's just for me and just for personal expression. It's not like any kind of like massive website or anything. But if I got those through, if someone said to me, "Can I publish this on your website?" and gave me that, I'd say no. I would have said no, because the technical quality, the writing, the assumptions, the brazenly false, misapprehended, and just purely bad faith assumptions on which they operate were just appalling. The one that really got my goat, and this is true of almost all of them, but the one that really got my goat was one that was published in The Guardian, which I will link to down below. And you can tell from the very first sentence that not only is this an inadequate and infantile piece of work, but that the person doing the review is simply not qualified to be doing it. The first sentence is a foot-stamping temper tantrum. It's a narcissistic, egocentric display of self-interest. I don't like horror. That's the first fucking sentence. This sort of foot-stamping, infantile. Yeah, if I'd written that, if I was doing like a journalism course at university and I'd written that as the opening line of one of my articles, the tutor would have come back to me and said, "Do it again. Write it properly." I would have come back to someone. If I was in fucking high school, I'd have pointed out that this is not how you do a review. This is not how you start a purportedly professional review. First of all, that the first fucking word, me, me. This is all about me. It's not about the actual product. It's not about the actual work. It's about me. It's about what I think and about my preconceptions. I don't like horror. Also, what a brazenly stupid statement. I mean, what a brazenly general, meaningless, vacuous statement. What do you mean you don't like horror? What does that even mean? Horror in and of itself. It doesn't, it's one of those statements that doesn't take any time to define its own terms or the assumptions upon which it operates. Well, what preconception of horror makes you think you don't like it? What don't you like about it? And the article does not go on to explain at all. It does not go on to illuminate. It does not define what horror is for this writer or anything like that. It just says, "I don't like horror." It's the critical equivalent of just throwing toys out of the pram and making the article all about the person. It's a really good demonstration of how bad, how degenerate our national mainstream media has become, because this was not published on some scrappy little website or by some internet critic. This is by a professional critic who is being paid by one of the biggest international newspapers in the land. It's absurd. It's absurd, and it doesn't get any better. The article then goes on to make frankly, a statement that's so misapprehended, that's so absurd. It's very difficult to unpick and to tackle. Another example of just how terrible the writing is, just how infantile the writing is. All caps locks, all capital letters. Ghosts don't exist, so ghosts aren't scary. It's like, what? What are the implications of that? I mean, this demonstrates that not only is the writer supremely unqualified for writing about horror fiction and horror media, it also demonstrates that they simply don't understand how stories work. They don't understand how humanity engages with stories and how narrative and mythology are innate to our species. They're parts of how we operate, how we interpret the world, and how we engage. The implication of this is that if things aren't real, you can't feel emotion about them, which is blatantly untrue. It's blatantly false. I don't believe ghosts exist, like not in any physical or real sense, but that doesn't mean that I can't engage with ghost stories. That doesn't mean that I can't find horror films frightening. Anyone who engages with fiction on any level above the purely infant, in fact, there are some infants who can engage with fiction on a higher level than this. They have that capacity of removing their own parameters, of placing themselves into a virtual situation where they can accept the parameters and the assumptions of a fictional world and thereby be moved by it, be aroused by it, be scared by it. Pornography is not real. How many people are emotionally aroused by pornography? The situations in pornography are not real. I mean, how utterly absurd. We are creatures that respond to metaphor. The history of our species is mythological. There is not a culture in all of human existence that doesn't have its own traditions, its own oral stories, its own mythologies, its own folk tales. We all have them to some greater or lesser degree, and none of them are real either. But that doesn't mean that we can't be scared, aroused, inspired by them. What a ridiculous statement. I mean, at that point, you should really stop reading, because this person is not qualified. They have not only do they not understand how horror works, they actually don't understand how fiction works. It's like it's written by someone who's never taken a critical theory class in their lives, who's never read a book about human interpretation of created things, where meaning and significance derive from, how you apply particular filters to the interpretation of fiction. It's like they've never considered it. It's the most absurd thing, and this is pervasive in almost every mainstream review I have seen of Bly Manor. This is absolutely pervasive. And it's part of, I mean, I think it's bad faith myself. I don't think that they are this incompetent. I don't think that they are this misinformed. I think it's bad faith. I think they're pandering to a particular demographic. I think there is this pervasive literary snobbery when it comes to things like horror fiction, horror media, and the Guardian readers in particular. The Guardian critics are aware that their readers operate within this particular prescribed bracket, this particular set of parameters, and that's who they're catering to. That's who they're catering to. They're not this foolish, they're not this stupid, but apparently they like to pretend they are. And I hate bad faith. I really loathe bad faith, especially when someone's being paid for it. It's appalling. It is absolutely appalling, and it demonstrates, I mean, it may seem small potatoes given some of you look at like how the media is treated, like Jeremy Corbyn, for example, or certain people in the international eye, and it seems like small potatoes, but it is the same phenomena. It's part of the same phenomena. The fact that we allow for this bad faith, this dishonesty, in our day-to-day discourses, in our media, that we allow people to be paid for it is grotesque. It's grotesque wherever it comes from and whatever it's applied to. And the people who engage with it should be ousted from their positions. They should be fired immediately, and go and do something that they're perhaps a bit more qualified for, or that they have some aptitude for. Because I can tell you now, these reviewers, these critics, do not have any kind of aptitude for what they are apparently being paid to do. It's the most obscene situation. Now, on to Bly Manor itself. As you may know from my review of The Haunting of Hill House a few years back, when that first hit the scene, I was massively impressed by that piece of work. I was massively impressed because it surprised the heck out of me. I was dreading it. I was absolutely dreading it, because adaptations of The Haunting of Hill House do not tend to be that good. There's one or two exceptions. The original 1963 film, The Haunting, is amazing. One of the best haunted house films ever made. Beyond that, there isn't much. In fact, there's some execrable works applied to The Haunting of Hill House, some execrable works derived from it, which is a real shame, because Shirley Jackson's original novel is actually one of the seminal haunted house texts. It's one that you really should read. The Haunting of Bly Manor, the minute that was optioned, I just got chills up my spine. I was so excited, because the Bly Manor is from The Turn of the Screw, which is Henry James' The Turn of the Screw, which is another one of those seminal haunted house texts that I love so much. It's a really brilliant, beautiful piece of work that explores some phenomenally deviant notions. I mean, I remember when I first read it, when I first read Turn of the Screw, I found myself shocked at where it went. I found myself thinking, it's not going to this particular place, is it? It's not doing what I think it's doing. And then it is. It doesn't ever overtly come out and tell you precisely what is going on. But when you realize, when you learn what is happening in the book, and in order to do so, you do need to understand fiction. You need to engage with things like implication. You need to be able to infer. But when you do realize what James is getting at towards the end of the book, it's really unpleasant. It's really horrible. Beautiful piece of work. So I was a little apprehensive, but at the same time, given the quality of The Haunting of Hill House, I was very excited, because this seems like the perfect subject matter. I was very surprised. I was as surprised by this work as I was by The Haunting of Hill House, and not for any particular negative reason. One thing I will say is this series is not going to be as unambiguously runaway successful as The Haunting of Hill House, because it's not the same thing. It's not following a particular pattern or template. It's actually trying to do something very, 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 very different. In fact, remarkably different. It's telling an entirely different story with an entirely different metaphysics, under entirely different parameters and preconceptions. It's a slower story. It's about 5 episodes in before things start to unravel, before things start to happen. And what it's doing during those first 5 episodes, it's all set up. Now, your mileage may vary as to whether that appeals to you or not. For my money, I love that slow build. For me, that echoes beautifully Henry James's original novel, because The Turn of the Screw is like that. It takes ages before anything actually occurs in The Turn of the Screw, because it's setting up the situation, it's setting up the characters, and that's exactly what this does. And I actually really loved that. I love the slow build, I love the slow burn. I liked the characters enough that it didn't bother me. Most of the characters are really charming. There have been issues raised with it presents this these various British stereotypes filtered through a USA lens, and I suppose there are issues with that, because they are heightened. They're almost fairy tale in a way. But I actually really rather liked that. And there's some dodgy accents as well. That's for damn sure. There are some accents that are kind of all over the place, but that's fine. I didn't actually mind that at all. I liked the sort of heightened fairy tale quality that it had, because The Turn of the Screw is like that. And because in The Turn of the Screw, everything is filtered through an unreliable narrator, it's kind of the same thing that's happening here, only you've got a series of unreliable narrators. What I realized this series was doing, which I thought it was very successful at, was it isn't just The Turn of the Screw. It isn't just an adaptation of The Turn of the Screw. What it does is it takes Henry James's entire back catalogue, almost every ghost story the guy ever wrote, and just hurls it together in this one uber mythology. And you know what? For the most part, it works really well. when the scares start to happen, they're very well drawn, they're very well put together. The metaphysics of it all is massively interesting, and the way it introduces and frames characters is really appealing. I liked the way the characters turned out in the end. There are character arcs that are very surprising and which are signposted in the subtlest ways. You don't really know what's going to happen or why until you get this sort of in media res thing happening where the show lurches back and shows you what actually happened and why certain things are happening. I thought it was very well done. You've got characters like the children who are directly from the turn of the screw, and bizarrely, despite it being set in the 1980s, they act and operate like they're children from like the 19th century. They even dress like children from the 19th century, and that bizarrely works as well. It shouldn't. It should feel weird, but it kind of does. They clash in terms of it gives them this slightly heightened fairy tale quality, and that works in context with the themes of the turn of the screw, because one of the things the turn of the screw points out is that the children are very unusual. They do comport themselves in this heightened and adult way that is distressing and disturbing, you know. They even, I mean, the boy even engages in the turn of the screw, engages in a way that's interpersonally adult and almost romantically and sexually adult, and that's really disturbing, really distressing. Um, I really loved it. One of the big, I mean, spoilers by the way, but one of the big changes in this adaptation, of course, is that the in the turn of the screw, the ghosts aren't necessarily metaphysical. It's ambiguous, but they aren't necessarily metaphysical. There may actually be no ghosts in Turn of the Screw. It may actually just be the unreliable perceptions of a narrator whose mind is not healthy, whose mind is breaking down because of various parameters placed on it. And the setting of Bly Manor, with all of its dark past, with all of its bleak resonance and whatnot, that just feeds on it. It's almost like the mythology and history of Bly Manor acts as in the same way that Hill House does, it acts as a kind of resonator for psychic ailment. And that's what happens to the protagonist. They slowly lose their minds in the worst way imaginable. This is different. This is actually rather different. It makes you think that might be the case, and then it kind of turns it around and introduces stuff from other Henry James stories and marries them to the mythology, which I actually rather liked. I actually rather liked quite a lot. I thought I was surprised by some of the turns by the end. There's an episode towards the end, which is basically they throw in it's an entire short story of Henry James's. I can't remember the exact title. It's something like the the something of old clothes. I can't quite remember. It's been ages since I've read the story. But that entire story becomes part of the mythology of Bly Manor. And the entire story is adapted here and works pretty well, I've got to say. I loved this whole show works with regard. The only reason it works is because of the characters. It's not it's not necessarily what you might call a horror story, despite the fact that it has ghosts and metaphysics and all that kind of thing. It's not really a horror story, not in the same way that Hill House was. Hill House is much more disturbing. Hill House is much more pervaded by horrors and ghosts and spectres and things. This is about the characters first and foremost. It is much more psychological, it's much more interpersonal, and your mileage may vary as to whether you like that or not, especially in combination with some of the British stereotypes that are in this show. And then, you know, they're pretty profound. They're pretty overt. The stereotypes are pretty overt. On the other hand, there are characters who entirely defeat stereotype and are really interesting. I loved the cook and the housekeeper. I thought those two were my favorite characters in the entire thing. Their entire story, I thought, was fantastic, and the actress and the actor were just spectacular. I mean, they were just spectacular in this. I loved them both to bits. It did that thing with the housekeeper. It did that thing that it did with Mrs. Crane from Hill House. It framed her. The way the show framed her, she's a beautiful actress anyway. I mean, she is like statuesque and like a I don't know, like an idol come to life. She is absolutely beautiful. But the show always frames her such that she seems slightly unreal, that she seems slightly ethereal. And I thought that was brilliant too. I thought that was absolutely gorgeous. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much. It is not Hill House. It is not the same kind of story. They're not trying to tell the same kind of story. And I feel as though some people who liked Hill House probably won't like this one. They might bow out before it gets going. That slow burn is a slow burn. I mean, it's a long, slow burn, and you may not like that. As I say, for me, especially with this kind of ghost story, I actually really like that. I like slow burns in horror. I like when films take time to set up what's going on. Um, and with reference again to the original discussion about the Guardian article. The absurdity of it, the assumption that ghosts aren't scary because ghosts aren't real. I mean, really, a lot of the ghosts in this story aren't trying to scare you. That's not the point of them. It's entirely it's missing the point of the ghosts in this story. More than anything, the pervasive emotion of this one is sorrow, it's loss, it's sadness. Even the more, I mean, in the original book, in The Turn of the Screw, um, Peter Quint is this, he's not even a character who physically occurs in the original story. He's a myth, he's a legend. He was someone who worked at Bly Manor and was an awful man by all accounts. I mean, like, in the original book, he is just loathsome. There's nothing redemptive about him at all. There's nothing even vaguely human. He's almost like an avatar of negativity who hangs over the entirety of Bly and whose influence can be felt as this unseen, unspoken evil. Here, he's a shit. He's a negative character, but he's also human. He also has something that makes him more identifiable, that anchors him a little bit more. And that's really interesting. You even get why he's doing what he's doing. It makes sense. I understand why he's doing it. And I love the way that the show tries to humanize him and give him a little bit more, that gives him some human anchorage and some human emotion. I liked that. I thought it was done very well. Another clever trick this show does, and Peter Quint is a really good example of this. It takes the actors, because it's an ensemble piece, a little bit like American Horror Story, but with a million times better than that, a million times more competent. It takes the actors who played fairly sympathetic characters in the original story and makes them play less sympathetic characters in this one. So it kind of inverts that. I thought that was rather clever. I liked that rather a lot myself. Yeah, it's a very interesting piece of work. It's different. It's very different from Hill House. It's a entirely different experiment. But for my money, for what I want and like from ghost stories, I enjoyed it very much. I thought it was beautifully shot. I mean, the directorial team for these series, is they are painterly. They understand the framing of shots and the framing of scenes. They understand camera movements as ways of telling story, and that's very impressive. I have a penchant for the artistry of cinematography. I enjoy it. I enjoy it when people behind the camera understand that what they're doing is changing and shifting and influencing the mood and the feeling of what's going on. And these series, both of them, are fantastic examples of that. There are some very clever shots in Bly, very subtle and very clever, which you may not notice unless you're looking for them, where there are like unbroken panning shots that pass through different time frames. Very clever, very beautiful. I mean, I really, really love these series on a technical level, if for nothing else. This one, as I've said, it's going to be more ambiguous. It's not going to be the runaway hit that Hill House was. And people's mileage may vary, but for my money, I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I had a blast being in this series. Not in the, you can't be in the company of the same characters because they're not, but in the company of the cast and in the company of the creators again, and in a story that's being told well. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really looking forward to what the next one will be. Can't imagine what it will be, but I'm very, very much looking forward to it. Until next time, my loves. Bye bye.